And welcome. This is the interview where we go beyond what everyone else in the media is asking. If you just want that, this isn't the place for it. Today, we want to talk about a lot of topics, getting to the esoteric elements of what's happening so that we can reveal what's really going on. Today, we're talking three things: a recent national ruling on tariffs, the objectivity of the Federal Reserve, and the possibility of the National Guard heading to other cities where crime has historically been an issue. Now, we want to know about Detroit, so let's start there with analyst and attorney John Day. Thank you so much, Mr. Day, for joining us and giving us some insight.
Thanks for having me.
So Detroit isn't among the list that the president has named of potential cities being targeted for possibly intervening with the National Guard, but we're already seeing a lot of cities being named by the president. Do you have any indication, or are you hearing anything, that Detroit could be on the list?
Right. So this is a really interesting question. What we've seen so far is National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. Well, that's a little bit different. Washington, D.C. is the federal city. And so, of course, the president has the authority to use the National Guard in the District of Columbia. Detroit, other cities, it's a very different situation. These are places where the governors and the mayors have not necessarily invited the National Guard in. You've got the Trump administration saying, well, there are high crime cities all over the country. We're going to be using National Guard troops to back up and take the place of law enforcement. So what it's going to come down to is really a test. And it's going to be a test in the courts and a test at the Supreme Court, I'm sure, of whether a president can, without the invitation from a mayor or a governor, use National Guard, federalized National Guard troops to use in place of law enforcement. The one way to do that is to use something called the Insurrection Act, which has really never been done to this level. There would have to be basically a finding of a lot of civil unrest, a lot of armed insurrection against the government, to have that take effect. And we haven't really seen that yet, but this could be really the biggest and most significant test of whether the president can do that.
Yeah, you know, on the Insurrection Act, there are some who look at that and say civil unrest can be, for example, law enforcement being shot and killed by police. If you've had an incident of that, then that is a reasonable type of pushback against the government and calls into question whether the government has full control in its police force over the citizens, and that civil unrest also can be defined as rampant homicides. Could you see the administration making an argument like that?
Right. I think they are going to make the argument. One of the issues, though, is what are the crime statistics showing? In fact, there are a lot of stats that show that crime is actually on a decline in a lot of the places where the Trump administration seems to be focusing their efforts. And of course, there are arguments that they're only focusing in areas where there are Democratic governors, Democratic mayors. But aside from that argument, the issue is also, how do you view those crime stats? And if they are, in fact, showing there's a decrease in crime, does that justify say the Insurrection Act? Does that justify the use of federalizing National Guard troops, who are normally and almost always under the control of state governors? So this is really going to be a clash. It's going to be a test to see whether the Trump administration can implement this policy. And then what kind of pushback are we going to see from the mayors and from the governors? And is there going to be widespread public support in these cities where they're targeting the National Guard? Or is there going to be a reaction that says, you know, we don't want you here, our local people can handle this, but back us up in other ways?
When you look at the Constitution, it's never seemingly black and white. You're balancing Article 2 considerations with the commander-in-chief abilities and the effort that certainly the president is saying he has the ability under the Constitution to do this. But you also have Article 1, Section 8 about militia clauses and not being able to send the National Guard, or really any force that could be described as a militia, and I suppose you could make that argument, into any place without the gubernatorial support, coming from that particular state. So which weighs out if we're looking at a constitutional test here?
Right. Again, that is going to be the ultimate question. If the president decides that using the Insurrection Act is something that he wants to do, he wants to invoke that, he wants to say there is, in my opinion, an emergency here, a crime emergency that rises to the level of basically an armed revolt against the government, whether it's the local, state, or federal government, then we're going to see whether that survives the test. And I think this is certainly going to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's certainly going to be something that ultimately is going to be decided at the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, what is the response going to be if that's where the Trump administration goes? If they decide to say, Insurrection Act, it applies here, there's an emergency. And I think really the test is going to be not only the legal test, but also sort of the cultural and social test. When people see National Guard troops in their city, is there a sense of relief that crime is being addressed and that the streets are safer? Or is there a sense that this is really an overreach, it's an unconstitutional broad power grab by the president? And, we haven't really seen how that's going to play out. It really remains to be seen.
Yeah, I wonder about the efforts that are already underway. So in our state, for example, there are a number of Democrats who are discussing whether there should be, on the legislative front, a prohibition of the president coming in and sending in National Guard troops here. And the idea would be that they would, to increase the enforceability of constitutional protections, have this legislation that says you cannot send National Guard troops into Michigan without the explicit consent of the governor, which in this case happens to be a Democrat for now. And so it's likely that she would say no way to that. However, if this does reach a constitutional test, the Insurrection Act could be deployed. And I wonder then if it's not the Constitution against the Constitution, or maybe competing clauses, but if it's the Constitution against this statewide legislation, which wins then, in your mind?
Right, and that kind of highlights the actual issue here. The states, if you have states, and I know the legislature in Michigan the Democrats are trying to put together a response to it that says, basically, you're not welcome here if you're going to do that. The question's going to be, though, under our system, under our judicial system, under the federal system, will the president's invocation of, say, the Insurrection Act, if that's what he does, if that, for lack of a better term, if that trumps the state legislative response, if that's how the Democrats choose to go. So, again, these are questions that most likely are going to be hashed out and decided at this ultimately Supreme Court level. But it's very interesting to watch what the responses are locally. It's really interesting to see whether you have a sense of local relief for example, of National Guard troops patrolling the streets. Do people feel safer? And is that going to play into a response around the country? We haven't seen the National Guard federalized and brought into the cities other than D.C. and Los Angeles was a very specific issue. Apparently, they were going to be there for protection of the federal assets. Very different from what the Trump administration is proposing now. So we have some examples, but they're not exactly right on point. And so what it's going to take is an actual imposition or invocation of that Insurrection Act. And are you going to see National Guard vehicles and tanks and armed personnel carriers on the streets of Detroit or Chicago or other cities where the Trump administration has targeted? Again, it's going to wind up in the courts.
Yeah. Let's look to the historical perspective as well. Eisenhower deploying the 101st Airborne in Little Rock, Arkansas, and 1967 right here in Detroit with the uprising that occurred here. And there were National Guard troops deployed during those riots, insurrection, however you want to describe it. So there is some historical precedent for the president, as the commander-in-chief, deploying National Guard troops to get a situation under control. And you could argue that rampant homicides, even if they're spread out throughout the course of a year, that again, is civil unrest. What say you?
Right. Well, again, and you're looking at it's good to bring up the historical precedent. John F. Kennedy brought National Guard troops into Mississippi in '63, for example. And that was an example of the federal government against the wishes of the local officials, against the wishes of the governor, bringing in federalizing the National Guard, bringing them in to implement a federal policy regarding desegregation of higher education institutions. We haven't seen that since then, but President Eisenhower did bring in active duty U.S. Army troops into Little Rock a few years before that. So there are certainly some examples here, but the most recent examples are a long time ago and in a very different cultural and social context. So again, this is a place where we don't have a roadmap, really. We don't really know what it's going to look like, but we do know that there are a lot of strong opinions on both sides. Ultimately, those are going to be hashed out in a court. Of Court of Appeals, ultimately going up to, I think, the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, let's tackle the next topic. So we're talking the independence of the Federal Reserve. And the idea of a central bank, not just in the United States, but really everywhere, is that monetary policy can be completely devoid of politics. Now, we know that that's not in practice the way it happens all the time, but that's the idea. We're trying to get as close to political neutrality when it comes to our monetary policy as possible. Obviously, it affects inflation, it affects recession, or whether we head towards a recession. So do you see the recent handling of the Federal Reserve as being removed from politics, or do you think this is mostly political?
Right. Well, again, this is a fascinating clash. We haven't seen anything like this for the first time. You have a sitting president trying to remove a duly appointed governor of the Federal Reserve and using not, I mean, there may be an underlying policy dispute. That may be why President Trump wants to remove this governor. But what they're claiming, at least on the outset of this, is that there was misconduct by the appointed Federal Reserve governor.
Yeah, Lisa.
That somehow she was.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Somehow she was using misusing the mortgage system, had a couple of mortgages, or somehow there was misconduct in mortgages before she was on the board. And so what we're seeing is, even though there may be, the ultimate goal may be the removal of someone who the president wants off the board so that he'll have a board that's more amenable to his policy. They're trying to use this idea that there's misconduct. That's really the only way to get rid of a Federal Reserve governor, is by claiming that there's misconduct, or somehow there's moral turpitude or something that fits within the regulations as they exist now that lets them remove one of the governors. Never been done before. We haven't seen this before. And so the idea is it's not going to be another one of those situations where it's a clash of the two sides. You've got the president in the executive branch saying, we want to assert our authority over the Federal Reserve, which has always generally been a quasi-independent, non-political, to the extent that it could be, and not beholden to the sitting president. This would be the first time that we've seen a sitting president try to mold that board to match his policies. And how this plays out, it's going to be really interesting.
Well, and Governor Lisa Cook could easily just release the documents that are related to the allegations being put forward by the administration and clear up a lot of questions here about whether there was any misfeasance or malfeasance on the part of Ms. Cook. That hasn't happened yet, and that is a fair point from the administration. On the other hand, though, those who are saying this is just politically motivated, especially because the Fed has so much ability to affect the financial future of this country, which to you is more important? How do you handle this, and should maybe some sort of independent agency be conducting this investigation, whatever that would be?
Right. And again, it's important to note that there haven't been any charges filed against Governor Cook of the Federal Reserve Board. Nothing concrete has been lodged in any court of law or anything like that. These are just allegations at this point. But it does highlight the issue of the response from the Trump administration is, look, we were elected. I mean, we were the ones who the people voted for. Nobody voted for the Federal Reserve Board. And so we're the ones who are being accountable to the people who put us in office. And if you follow that line of reasoning, we have the ability, we ought to have the authority to remove governors from that board. And in this case, they're trying to use the misconduct allegation. But the argument from the Trump administration is, who was elected to office? Was it the governors of the Federal Reserve Board? No, it was not. It was us, President Trump and his team. So that's the position they're taking. At this point, they're going to have to back up these allegations at some point. But again, nothing formally has been filed against Governor Cook. I think it remains to be seen what comes out, if there's anything that backs up these allegations. But this just highlights this clash of the traditional independence of that board and the goals and the dreams of the Trump administration to get a board that's more amenable to its positions. Well,
and you also said that these are dreams, and there are plenty, not just in conservative circles or liberal circles, but folks who want to see maybe more accountability for the Federal Reserve, that this sort of starts walking us down that path, questioning whether or not this independent body, which can decide to ease or take a much more hawkish position and completely change interest rates and what we pay to borrow money, that there is already some sort of questioning of the non-delegation doctrine, and that this is a way to sort of start that discussion in a real way, that this could be the impetus for maybe unraveling the entire construct of the Federal Reserve, which some say is blatantly unconstitutional and anti-American. Is that the direction we're heading in?
Well, I think you put it right. You said start the discussion, because that is what it has done ultimately, because up until this point, this issue has never come to the forefront the way that President Trump has brought it. So what does this mean? Well, does it mean that it's going to become more easier to replace members of the Federal Reserve, replace those governors who oversee that quasi-independent agency? I think if the Trump administration is successful at this, of course, that's going to open the floodgates to more challenges. And of course, the ultimate question is, do people want that accountability that you talked about? Do they want to say, look, we voted for the president. We voted him in. We didn't vote for these governors of the Federal Reserve Board. So who are they accountable to? The counter argument is, well, it's important to have the checks and balances of an independent or quasi-independent agency like the Fed. But if you take the Trump administration's argument, they're saying, look, we're the ones who are holding them accountable because we're accountable to the voters who put us in office.
Yeah, let's talk about also just generally the precedent, which you started to allude to, this idea that there are agencies that are insulated from politics. And I think every American also believes that we should be able to have those. That's sort of a catch-22. How can you insulate something from politics and also have the interference of political figures? You can't have both. You have to choose one or the other. You can either try to have agencies that are apolitical, or they're just going to be political, and that we'll all have a say, and we'll engage in representative democracy more directly. Should we have agencies that have the appearance of insulation, or is that really not even possible?
Well, you know, this kind of the ultimate question, and you raised the idea of accountability. Who's the Fed accountable to? If it's not the voters, and who's the president accountable to? And it's that argument that hasn't been decided yet, and ultimately could go to the Supreme Court. But the concept is, nobody voted for the Federal Board of Reserve Governors. They were appointed, of course, by people elected to office, a president. But at the same time, if that president feels like that board is not in line with the president's agenda, which, you know, obviously is a pretty aggressive economic agenda, what steps can the president take? You know, the other example that's going on is the Trump administration trying to remove the head of the Centers for Disease Control. It's a different story, because that's someone who's directly in line of the executive branch. It's not a quasi-independent agency. So on the one hand, you've got the Trump administration saying, the CDC, we want them to be more in line with our agenda. On the Federal Reserve issue, they have to deal with an agency that really has never been beholden to anybody, to the voters or anybody who has to go in and cast a ballot. So interesting arguments, two different situations, but they both highlight the efforts by this administration to exert enormous control over public policy and financial policy.
Yeah, do you think that the judiciary should somehow consider some broader norms of really ascertaining whether or not an issue is political or not? I mean, this isn't something that we ask the judiciary to do beyond a strict statutory reading, typically, but maybe they have a role to play if something does appear to be politically motivated, although we can't say that for sure because we haven't seen the documents. But that the judiciary could sort of take a stand here and through precedent establish some sort of guidelines so that those who are in supposedly apolitical positions are guarded from political moves or perceived political moves.
And that is the issue. That's the battle that's going on right now. You've got people who perceive, for example, a lot of the federal judiciary as being as pushing back against the Trump administration's efforts to use its power more broadly than ever before. Opponents of the Trump administration saying the federal judiciary is the last line against this power grab, this pushback these these efforts by the Trump administration. On the other hand, there are those on the other side who say, look, these are activist judges, however you want to define that term, but these are judges who are trying to impose their will and their positions in place of duly elected representatives like the president and Congress, for example. So it's a clash that we haven't seen before. And from a lawyer standpoint, someone who follows the law, I mean, it's fascinating, and it raises a lot of issues that have never had to be addressed before. And I think we don't know how that's going to play out. We do know that the drama of the two sides right now is, it's from a lawyer standpoint, my standpoint, it's fascinating to watch. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but it does highlight two very different positions around the country as to the power of the executive, power of the president, and the role of the judges, the role of the judiciary. In do they push back against that? Do they hold the line? Do they allow the elected representatives more power than they're doing? So these are questions haven't been answered, but it's going to be a bumpy ride for a while.
Okay, let's move on to tariffs in the last portion of our conversation. We got about 10 minutes left, and a federal appeals court decided that basically the Trump administration and President Trump himself overstepped their authority under the International Emergency Economic Protections Act. And as a result of that, the tariff situation is, according to them, unconstitutional. This is another thing that will likely go to the Supreme Court, I assume you will say. So did he, in fact, overstep the bounds of his authority by issuing tariffs and by renegotiating these tariff deals? Or is this clearly within the purview of what the president should do? Negotiate with foreign powers to decide what tariff policy should be.
Right. Well, that was President Trump's argument. I'm the president. I have the ability to do this. Well, what happened was this federal appeals court, which handles very specific cases like trade cases, patent cases, things like that. This court of appeals said, President Trump, you did not have the authority under the existing laws to do what you did and impose these blanket tariffs on most of the world. The court did let some what they call sector-specific tariffs stay in place, like steel and aluminum, because they were more in line with the existing laws in the view of that court of appeals. But the court said the president did not have the authority to put out these blanket tariffs to all the countries in the world at those levels. President Trump was invoking, again, emergency powers that seemed to be in the existing laws. Court of Appeals judges, it was a 7-4 vote, so it wasn't unanimous, but it was a majority, obviously. And they said, no, the law is very clear that you don't have the ability, you don't have the authority to do what you did. The court is leaving those tariffs in place, though, until October. What they're doing is they're saying, okay, the Supreme Court can come back in the fall in a couple of months and address this issue, and the Supreme Court can be the one that decides. However, from our perspective, this is what the Court of Appeals judges are saying. From our perspective, it's clear that the president didn't have that authority. He overstepped his authority, and those tariffs are not legal. But the court didn't say you have to stop imposing them. The court said we're going to let these stand until the final deciders, the Supreme Court, gets a chance to take a look.
Yeah, and they did also, as you mentioned, they clarified that the IEEPA does confer these emergency economic powers, but that tariffs would be clearly within the purview of the legislative branch, and that this is the power of the purse, which we know Congress has. Did they make that distinction clear enough? If we stratify the two, the argument from the Trump administration could easily be that this was an emergency and we had to act right now to shore up our fiscal situation. What do you say?
Yeah, it's going to come down to basically the definition of an emergency. If the higher court decides that the president gets to make that call, and that there are factors that support that, and there's enough justification for that, then for the president's tariffs may stay in effect. It's really going to come down to how the highest court in the land views that law and views the actions of the Trump administration in invoking its emergency powers, and are there limits on emergencies? And again, the Trump administration is going to have to establish for its appeal that this, in fact, is an emergency, depending on how they define that. Again, That's been the argument and the other things we talked about, bringing in the National Guard, for example, to other cities. Are they expanding? Is the Trump administration expanding the definition of emergencies into areas that judges are going to say is not appropriate? Is that just a totally inappropriate use of the emergency powers? But in the eyes of the Trump administration, it's an effective tool, and it's also called for given their argument, which is that there are so many situations right now involving other countries and their trade with the U.S. that it's totally appropriate to invoke that. It's, from a legal standpoint, fascinating argument. Again, another test of executive versus legislative authority. But you've had at least the first bite of the apple from the Court of Appeals for this very specific Court of Appeals. It's not like a geographic court, for the South, the Northeast, or the Midwest. It's a court that handles trade issues like this one and patent issues. So these judges, anyway, by a 7-4 vote, said, President Trump, you don't have that authority. You overstepped your powers here. But they're not going to stop that. They're going to let those tariffs continue and stay in place until the Supreme Court gets a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, and it seems that this position also has been pretty well consolidated by other state-based lawsuits. Oregon versus DHS, for example. The U.S. Court of International Trade also ruled in May that the Trump administration can't go this far and that these types of tariffs are not constitutional. Does these pre-existing rulings bolster the position of critics of the Trump administration who say that the president has just gone too far and that he never had this kind of power?
5 or 7 years ago, I would have said, you're right. I would have said that's going to be a position that's going to be upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, though, given the makeup of this court and what we've seen coming out of the court, I'm not certain that you could say that. I think this court has adopted what seems to be an expansive, a pretty broad idea of what the presidential authority is. And so I don't think you can say with any kind of certainty what that court's going to do when this issue gets there, even though lower courts have put the brakes on. Lower courts have said, you can't overstep your authority. You can't impose these emergency conditions when there's no emergency. But it's a little unclear on whether the Supreme Court's going to go along with the lower branch of the lower courts, the appellate courts and the district courts that have had those rulings. So, again, it's a great time. It's a good time to be a lawyer if you like this kind of stuff. I mean, it's a little bit in the weeds sometimes, but the effects on the entire country are significant. Each one of these things we've been talking about ultimately comes down to affect people who are not lawyers, people who are just trying to, work day to day, put their kids through school, put food on the table. So we're talking about these things at a higher level of policy, but at the end of the day, they do affect everybody's day-to-day life. And that's what's sort of, to me, fascinating about the laws and the way these things are tested in court. How does it affect, those of us who are just trying to get through the day and make a living and put our kids through school?
Yeah, we're just about there, just about a minute. The issue, can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Okay, all right. I think I kicked off my mic for a second there, but does this decision, we have about a minute left, does this decision affirm in some ways bicameralism and presentment, that requirement that in our government, huge questions of fiscal authority, those lie with the legislature in our country, and that this ruling affirms that, and more generally, the question of, whether or not we're moving towards the concentration of executive power that we may not be able to pull back, whether there's a Republican or a Democrat in office, as quickly as you can.
Yeah, that's the issue. You've defined the key issue here, regardless of which case we're talking about. You've got the legislative branch, you've got Congress making its decisions and telling the president what the Congress wants to do. You've got the president pushing back. You've got the courts having to step in and make those decisions. It's ultimately going to tell us how powerful is Congress and how important are these congressional powers. And at the end of the day, who's going to win?
All right. John Day, thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate you taking some time on this Labor Day weekend, and we hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you.